Sleeping Kingdom. As the long centuries of waiting passed, the kingdom and its legendary dragon-challenging king started to fade away from the world's memory. Midlehem became a mythical place as the magical wall kept every traveler away. Some, however, tried to regain the entrance, but every time they tried they only faced a dead end. The Sealed Kingdom, as the rest of the world started to call it, stayed hidden for the next 600 years. Many generations of Hobbs walked on Midlehem's deserted streets and guarded its people. The most honorable duty was to watch over the Sleeping King himself, who would one day free them all from this spell. This post of honor went from father to son, and when the 600th anniversary of the dragon's attack dawned, the post was held by a hob called Luddy. "Good morning, your grace. I hope you have slept well," said Luddy, and pulled heavy curtains away from the window when the new day dawned. Every hob wanted to be the guardian of the king, but in Luddy's opinion it was the worst post in the entire kingdom. He was supposed to spend every single minute in the king's chamber just watching at him as he dreamt about his past years of glory. Sitting all day long in the king's chamber was like sitting in a lavish dungeon. Luddy was not allowed to exit from the chamber, and sometimes it was making him go mad. To make the time to go faster, Luddy played games. He had found a chess set in the chamber and played against the king. Of course, Luddy had to move the pieces on Richard's behalf, and then he turned the board. "You won a game, your grace. I have no idea how you do it," Luddy remarked after he had lost once again. King Richard didn't reply, but this was quite normal to Luddy. When he was not playing chess, he talked to the king, who never replied to him. At times Luddy considered it to be stupid, but even hearing of his own voice comforted him. "You know, Richard, last night I thought about Emma. She is always so beautiful when she brings me food. I love her nut brown eyes, and yesterday she had a rose behind her ear," Luddy told the king. He had been guarding King Richard for 50 years, so he didn't care about etiquette anymore. "She always smells so nice, and I would like to tell her how I feel about her. I wonder if you have any kind of advice how I could approach her." King Richard remained silent. "Of course, Richard. You are too proud to speak to a lowly hob," Luddy complained and started to sulk. Suddenly Luddy heard a soft moan. His heart missed a beat and he was all pins and needles. Moaning? How could that be possible? Could his grace be finally waking up after all these years? Indeed, it was now happening at last. King Richard moved onto his side and yawned. Luddy had no idea what to do next. He was afraid and nervous. He didn't know how the king would react when he saw Luddy. Would he be angry? Would he try to hurt Luddy? In growing panic, Luddy dived quickly under the bed and closed his eyes. If the king was now truly awake, it meant that the dragon was on the prowl as well. Luddy heard how the bed squeaked when the king slowly got up. Richard stretched his arms and rubbed his eyes. "The dragon!" he cried and jumped to his feet. However, the long years of immobility had taken their toll on him, and Richard lost his balance. He fell to the floor and a thick cloud of dust rose up in the air as he landed. King Richard moaned in pain. Luddy opened his eyes carefully and looked at the king whom he had sworn to protect. It was hard for him to believe his eyes. After all these centuries of waiting, The years of his captivity were now at end. Even though he was scared, Luddy felt a certain kind of pride. He was the first one to witness the king's awakening. Slowly King Richard managed to get himself back to his stiff feet. He had no memory of how he had ended up back in his chamber from the battlefield. The victory had been so close and then everything had just gone black inside his head. Since Luddy had neglected his cleaning duties, the thick cobwebs under the bed started to tickle his nose. He tried to hold it back, but soon he sneezed loudly. "Who is there?" Richard asked and looked around him. Luddy felt so ashamed that he could barely crawl out from under the bed. "I am Luddy, your grace, your personal guardian hob." Luddy introduced himself, keeping his gaze on his dusty toes. Richard looked at the hob, who was all covered in dust and cobwebs. He looked so ashamed that Richard felt sorry for the little guy. "Luddy," he repeated. "Yes, my lord. Your voice sounds familiar. I have been with you, your grace, quite some time, and during that time I spoke to you." Richard sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at the hob. "What happened, Luddy? Why, I am back here. Where is Francis and where is the dragon? Your grace, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but..." Luddy didn't know how to tell the horrible news to the king. "Out with it then, boy," Richard ordered. "The witch put a curse on you, which made you fall asleep for a long time." Luddy managed to explain. King Richard sat silently for a moment while his mind processed this information. "How long?" he asked with a thin voice. "Precisely 600 years, my lord." Luddy waited in terror for Richard's next move. When he had been just a little hob, he had dreamed about this moment, but now it hadn't gone the way he had hoped. King Richard turned his head away. This was more than he could bear. 600 years, he repeated in shock. "I'm so sorry, my lord." Luddy apologized. "What about my kingdom and court?" "They are all safe, your grace. They have waited alongside you and are now waiting for your return," Luddy hurried to explain. "Really?" "Yes, your grace." Then King Richard got up to his feet again. "What are we waiting for then? Let them all know that their lord is back." A smile returned to Luddy's wrinkled face. They were going out at last. Richard walked to his chamber's door and opened it. Luddy followed him and rejoiced at his freedom. Castle corridors were deserted apart from random servants who were still slumbering in the same spot where they had been for the last 600 years. "Where are my wife and son?" Richard demanded to know. "They are in the Queen's chamber, my lord," Luddy answered. "I must see them." Richard cried and started to run towards his wife's quarters. Soon he reached his wife's chamber and ripped the door open. The hob that was guarding the queen and prince screamed in sudden surprise. "Who are you and what business you have with my family?" Richard roared. "Your grace, you are back." The hob stuttered in amazement. King Richard hardly heard the hob's answer as he strode to his wife and son. He knelt beside Anne and touched her cheek. "I am here, my love. I came back to you," Richard whispered, but only silence replied to him. "Annie, Annie, please speak to me." The guarding hobs looked on helplessly while poor King Richard tried to tear down the magical wall between himself and his family. "Wake up, my love," he whispered in despair. A heavy silence fell in the chamber, which was only broken by the steady breathing of the queen and her prince. Ladi took one step closer to Richard. Your Grace, I was meant to tell you that when the Beaufort witch cast her curse upon you, your queen made a pact with a powerful mage called Adassa. The master of magic lulled the entire kingdom into enchanted slumber to wait for your return. Richard turned to Ladi. And why are they still asleep while I am back? Ladi looked nervously at his toes once again and said, besides your Grace's awakening, we are afraid that also the dragon which you almost managed to slay might be close by. He has well also been gone for 6 centuries licking his wounds under the ground, and we believe that once the world is released from his unwelcome presence the spell will be broken. Richard sighed deeply. How am I supposed to defeat the dragon if my army is still snoring? Without my soldiers my effort will be futile. Ladi thought about the king's words for a while, but then his gaze became brighter. Your Grace, my people have as much reason to loathe the fiery worm as you do. And if you are willing to let us, then I'm sure the Hobbs would stand with you. Would they indeed? Yes, Your Grace. I'm sure of it. If you could convince the elders of our clan, then I'm sure we would unite against the common enemy. In his sorrow and despair, King Richard felt a small spark of hope inside his heart. He stood up and looked at the Hobbs. Now then, you who were guarding my wife and son, what may be your name? Sif, sire, answered the other Hob. Well then, Luddy and Sif, where shall we find the elders? The Hobbs looked at each other and said together, in the kitchen quarters, Your Grace. Richard smiled at their enthusiasm, but before he left the chamber he knelt again beside his sleeping queen and promised, the time of our imprisonment shall soon be over, my love, and then we can all be together. I promise you that.